to say a few words of introduction and give you space here. Więc jeszcze raz po polsku witam Państwa serdecznie. Ja się nazywam Mariola Paruzel-Czachura, pracuję w Instytucie Psychologii Uniwersytetu Śląskiego. No i mam ogromną przyjemność dzisiaj gościć u nas profesora Bertrama Gawrońskiego, niestety online. Natomiast no, takie mamy możliwości, cieszymy się z tego, co jest. Dzisiaj profesor opowie nam o swoich badaniach w ramach psychologii moralności, w ramach modelu Cni, który pomaga nam dzisiaj badać i opisywać to, jak ludzie podejmują decyzje moralne. Zanim oddam mu głos, chciałabym najpierw powiedzieć dosłownie parę tylko słów o tym, kim jest pan profesor i jaka jest jego sylwetka naukowa. Więc przede wszystkim profesor Bertram Gawroński studiował filozofię, psychologię i socjologię w Niemczech. Następnie uzyskał tytuł doktora w roku 2001 z psychologii na Humboldt University Berlin. Aktualnie pracuje na stanowisku profesora na University of Texas w Austin w Stanach Zjednoczonych. Wcześniej pracował też na innych uczelniach, zarówno w Stanach Zjednoczonych, jak i Kanadzie, jak i w Niemczech. Bardzo dużo można by było mówić o dorobku pana profesora. Myślę, że krótko, najważniejsze, najciekawsze też rzeczy. Przede wszystkim otrzymał aż ponad 20 międzynarodowych nagród i wyróżnień za swoją pracę naukową. Między innymi na przykład jeden z jego artykułów znalazł się w 1% najczęściej cytowanych artykułów psychologicznych na całym świecie, albo też otrzymał nagrodę imienia Daniela Wegnera za wkład teoretyczny w psychologię. Jest autorem 6 książek, 39 rozdziałów w książkach, prawie albo już może ponad, trudno zliczyć, 140 artykułów naukowych, a jego prace były cytowane ponad 23 000 razy. I krótko, czym profesor się zajmuje. Celem jego badań jest w ogóle zrozumienie sądów i zachowań poprzez identyfikację procesów umysłowych, tak, leżących u ich podstaw. Główne pytania, jakie stawia, dotyczą podstaw i konsekwencji spontanicznych i celowych reakcji na przedmioty, jednostki, grupy, problemy społeczne i z tej pracy też jest najbardziej znany. I aby odpowiedzieć na te pytania, korzysta zarówno z metod laboratoryjnych, jak i internetowych, jawnych i niejawnych pomiarów badanych zmiennych, a także modelowania obliczeniowego i o tym właśnie modelowaniu będzie też warsztat 13 lipca, na który serdecznie dzisiaj zapraszam. Aktualnie bada też oceny moralne i podejmowanie moralnych decyzji i też to, jak kształtować zmianę postaw, między innymi bada też skutki dezinformacji. Ponadto też interesuje się podstawowymi zagadnieniami pomiaru psychologicznego oraz metateorią dotyczącą konstruowania i oceny teorii psychologicznych. A dzisiaj jest z nami tylko dlatego i przede wszystkim dlatego, że wspólnie prowadzimy badania naukowe z obszaru psychologii moralności, wykorzystujemy właśnie model Cni i po prostu zaprosiłam profesora na wykład. Projekt jest finansowany przez Metropolitalny Fundusz Wspierania Nauki. Więcej informacji o funduszu, o projekcie możecie poczytać Państwo zarówno na stronie internetowej uniwersyteckiej, jak i na stronie samego funduszu. Profesor będzie mówił w języku angielskim. Natomiast w razie jakichkolwiek pytań i wątpliwości proszę zgłaszać na czacie. Ja też chętnie służę wsparciem w tłumaczeniu, czy później, gdyby ktoś miał jakieś pytania odnośnie modelu albo badań, też chętnie wyjaśnię, proszę się ze mną skontaktować wtedy mailowo. Po wykładzie zaplanowaliśmy dyskusję. Proszę Państwa o pisanie na bieżąco, jeśli Państwo chcecie, swoich pytań na czacie w programie Zoom w języku polskim albo w języku angielskim. Na sam koniec pan profesor ustosunkuje się do tych pytań. Przypominam w związku z tym, że można nas zarówno oglądać poprzez Facebooka, YouTube'a, jak i na Zoomie, że niestety pytania można zadawać tylko na Zoomie, więc zostaje albo opcja zalogować się na Zoom i zadać pytania, albo też ewentualnie można napisać do mnie maila, to już Państwo musicie wygooglować. Ok, zapraszam na wykład. Bertram, please you can share your screen. Thank you again for accepting my invitation, and we are all very happy to have you here. There are a lot of people on Zoom, but also a lot of people are watching us on Facebook and YouTube because it's streaming, but only on Zoom people can ask questions on the chat. So, you know, they can ask questions through all your lectures. Don't worry about those chats. I will make them, you know, at the end in one file, and I will translate them into English if necessary, but we will do it at the end of the lecture. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much for Mariola. Maybe just like one thing, like if people have questions in between, I mean, they should just, I don't know, maybe raise their hand, and then if you don't mind monitoring, I'm happy to provide further explanation in between that. If there's some clarification questions, anything regarding discussion, I think maybe defer until the end. But if there's like some basic questions like for comprehension, then people should it's a little difficult for me to monitor if you don't mind. And then
yes,
just like making me aware of that if there's a question.
Yeah,
okay, so yeah. Okay, so now let me share my screen. Yeah, thank you so much again, Mariola, for organizing this. So I'm very excited to share some of our work that we've done over the last like 5 years, kind of on moral decision making. And so the title of my talk is Consequences, Norms, and General Action Tendencies. And we'll be specifically talking about work that we've done on the Cni model of moral decision making. So while the world is desperately waiting for the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, I would like to refresh your memory for a related medical event in the recent history. That's the West African Ebola epidemic, if some of you remember. So although the Ebola epidemic was not as close to home as the current COVID pandemic, and definitely not as severe, it actually received a lot of attention around the world, and especially in the United States. And in the United States, the starting point was actually this person here. So the name of the person is Dr. Ken Brantley. And Brantley was an American doctor who was working in Liberia. And he became widely known in the US as the first American citizen who got infected with the Ebola virus during the Ebola crisis. It soon became clear that Brantley would not survive unless he would be brought back to the United States for proper treatment. And so this case sparked a heated debate about what is actually the morally right thing to do in this case. So there were a couple of people who were very outspoken that we have a moral duty to bring Brantley back to the United States to save his life. On the other hand, there were also a lot of people who argued that the risk of causing an Ebola outbreak in the United States is just too high, and it might actually be better to let him die in Liberia to avoid the death of a larger number of people. And these conflicting views, they're prominently reflected in two philosophical principles known as utilitarianism and deontology. So according to the principle of utilitarianism, the moral status of an action depends on its consequences, whereas according to the principle of deontology, the moral status of an action depends on its consistency with moral norms. So in the case of Brantley's infection, the argument that we should actually let him die in Liberia and not return him to the United States, that resonates with the idea of utilitarianism, whereas the argument that we have a moral duty to save his life, that resonates with the principle of deontology. So different from the kind of like normative discussion about like what's the morally right thing to do, in philosophy, psychologists have actually become very interested in studying the reason why people like make utilitarian or deontological judgments. And so one prominent theory in this area is Josh Green's dual process theory, which argues that utilitarian judgments are the product of controlled cognitive analyses of costs and benefits, whereas deontological judgments, Green argues, are the product of automatic effective responses to the idea of causing harm. So this research is kind of prominently linked to what is known as the Trolley Dilemma, which most of you are probably familiar with. So the idea is that there's a runaway trolley approaching a worker who, for some weird reason, no one knows why, is tied to the tracks, basically there's an option. Oh no, sorry. So to a group of 5 workers who are tied to the tracks, but there is an option to redirect the trolley to a different track where it would kill only one person. And so the typical argument is that basically saying that it is acceptable or like approving of this action of redirecting the trolley so that it kills only only one person instead of 5, that would be considered a utilitarian judgment. But to say that no, it's wrong to do this, one should not kill another person regardless of the consequences, that would be considered a deontological judgment. So the trolley dilemma and like its various variants has received a lot of criticism, and one criticism is that the scenario is like not only artificial but actually almost like somewhat humorous. For like there's a different variant of the trolley dilemma called the Footbridge Dilemma, where the option is not to redirect the trolley but to push an overweight man from a bridge. And so participants in these kind of studies, they actually find it rather amusing that they can push an overweight man from a bridge. And the argument here is that this kind of like these humorous scenarios that almost make participants laugh, that they're not suited to judge moral judgments or moral decisions in real world scenarios where they do not really have any kind of like humorous component. But I would argue that that problem can be easily resolved by just like moving toward more realistic dilemmas. So if you, for example, think about 9/11 in New York City and the United States. There was a heated debate about whether it would be appropriate to shoot down a hijacked passenger plane that is approaching a densely populated area, or in this case, the Twin Towers in New York. And so in Germany, this, for example, went even before the Supreme Court about whether the German government would basically have the right to shoot down an abducted or hijacked passenger plane in such a case. So there's definitely nothing like humorous or funny about this kind of scenario, but it's structurally similar to the trolley problem in the sense that it's kind of like, are you willing to basically like engage in harmful action to save a larger number of people? But what I would argue is that even if we move to more realistic dilemmas, there's a much more fundamental structural problem in these kind of dilemmas, at least in the standard approach. And this issue is what I call the identification problem. So to illustrate the identification problem, let me go back to the basic ideas of utilitarianism and deontology. So according to the principle of utilitarianism, the moral status of an action depends on its consequences, whereas according to the principle of deontology, the moral status of an action would depend on its consistency with moral norms. So in that sense, one could say that a utilitarian judgment is a judgment that is somehow sensitive to the consequences of an action, whereas a deontological judgment is a judgment that is sensitive to like situationally relevant norms. So how do we know that a judgment is sensitive to consequences, and how do we know a judgment is sensitive to relevant norms? What we would do as psychologists is we would manipulate the consequences and see whether the judgment differs as a function of different consequences, and then we know, yes, the judgment is affected by the consequences. Same for deontological judgments. In order to find out if a judgment is sensitive to norms, we would manipulate situationally relevant norms and then see if the judgment is it differs as a function of different norms, and then based on that conclude that the judgment is sensitive to norms. The issue in research using the trolley problem and various other kinds of structurally similar dilemmas is that consequences and norms are pretty much never manipulated. So let me explain why this is an issue. And let me start with utilitarian judgment. So why is it a problem that consequences are not manipulated? So for that, let me go back to the trolley dilemma. So assume that there is a participant who says that it is acceptable to redirect the trolley to a different track where it would kill only one person instead of 5. So the typical interpretation would be that this participant would have made a utilitarian judgment. So now imagine an alternative scenario where we basically have everything the same, but this time the trolley is just approaching a track where there's only one person tied to the track, and that person would be killed. And you would ask your participants, would it be acceptable to redirect the trolley in this case? So if a person would, or a participant would say, yes, it's still acceptable, regardless of whether there's one person who's being killed versus 5 person that is being killed. That person's judgments would obviously not be sensitive to consequences, and it would be kind of weird or almost absurd to call this person a utilitarian, because that person's judgment is just not affected by the consequences of their action. Instead, what we might have a different expression that we might want to use for these kind of participants. We might, I don't know, be tempted to call this person a psychopath who's just like willing to cause harm no matter of the consequences. And there is indeed a large body of research showing that people who score high on traditional measures of psychopathy, that they're actually more likely to endorse the so-called utilitarian option in the Trolley Dilemma. But does this mean that psychopaths care about maximizing the well-being of the larger number of people, or like maximize the greater good? Probably not. Psychopaths are probably like less likely to care about causing harm. But in the traditional Trolley Dilemma, we don't know what's going on. I mean, we obviously have some intuitions in this particular case, but we wouldn't know because consequences are not manipulated. Another problem related to the identification problem is that norms are not manipulated. So let me explain why that is an issue as well. The traditional Trolley Dilemma, virtually all of its variants and cousins, focus primarily on proscriptive norms. And these are norms that specify what people should not do, like you should not kill other people, for example. Those are distinguished from prescriptive norms who specify what people should do. And this is important because depending on the momentary salient or relevant situationally relevant norm, the deontological response would actually be very different. So in the case of a proscriptive norm, the deontological response would be inaction, whereas the deontological response would be action. So in the Trolley Dilemma, as I said, deontological responses are always inaction versus utilitarian responses are always action. But the point is, that doesn't have to be the case. And to illustrate that, let me go back to the Ebola dilemma that I pointed out at the beginning of my talk. So here, the mapping of utilitarianism and deontology with action versus inaction is actually exactly opposite. So here, the utilitarian view would state that it is better not to act, not to return Brentley back to the United States in order to maximize well-being, and that is like avoid an Ebola outbreak in the United States. On the other hand, the deontological view, different from the Trolley Dilemma, would actually argue that the relevant implication is action. We have a moral duty to save Brentley's life and bring him back to the United States. And that involves action. So here the mapping of action and inaction with utilitarianism deontology is exactly opposite to the Trolley Dilemma. So why is this an issue? The reason is that people may show like a general preference for inaction over action, regardless of what kind of norm is currently salient. So for example, in the Trolley Dilemma, people may prefer like, no, it's not okay to do this, but then they might also say in the Ebola examples, like, no, let's rather not do this. And so that would be kind of like a pattern of general action aversion or a general preference for inaction over action. But I would argue that this should not be equated with sensitivity to moral norms, where people are sensitive to proscriptive and prescriptive norms. Instead, what this seems much closer to is a phenomenon known as the omission bias, which refers to the phenomenon that people perceive harm caused via action as worse than the same amount of harm caused via inaction. And that is basically associated with the general preference for inaction. So in the traditional example, we cannot distinguish between these two kind of cases. And so that's basically true for all of the research using trolley dilemmas and any kind of like related to kind of sacrificial dilemmas. Okay, so what this all leads to is basically an argument that I would make, that we, instead of just like looking at one specific type of dilemma where there's a proscriptive norm that prohibits action and the benefits of action are greater than the cost, just like in the trolley problem, we need to actually look at multiple different kinds of dilemmas with different properties, and then basically look at response patterns across these dilemmas. And so basically what we would have to do, that's my argument, is that we on the one hand have to manipulate the situation relevant norms. Is it a proscriptive norm that prohibits action, or is it a prescriptive norm that prescribes action? And we also have to manipulate consequences, that the benefits of action are either greater than the costs or smaller than the costs, all for the greater good. So again, as I said earlier, the trolley dilemma and its variants usually or specifically focus on cases involving a proscriptive norm that prohibits action and the benefits of action are greater than the costs. And then it's typically inferred that when people show a preference for action, that they've shown a utilitarian response, but when they show a preference for inaction, they're said to have made a deontological response. What I would argue is that action is necessary. Action on this kind of dilemma is necessary, but insufficient for classification of the response as utilitarian. And correspondingly, I would argue that inaction on this kind of dilemma is necessary, but insufficient to identify a response as deontological. So for the utilitarian response, what I would argue is that people would have to show a preference for action whenever the benefits of action are greater than the costs, but they should show a preference for inaction when the benefits of action are smaller than the costs. So that would show that that the responses are sensitive to the consequences in a utilitarian sense, and then we can call this a utilitarian response. Similarly, for deontological responses, as I said earlier, I would argue that inaction on these traditional kinds of dilemmas is necessary but insufficient for classifications of a response as deontological. What needs to be shown is that there's a preference for inaction whenever there's a proscriptive norm that prohibits action, but a preference for action whenever there's a prescriptive norm that prescribes action. In these cases should be distinguished from patterns of like general inaction, where people might show like a general action aversion and prefer inaction regardless of the salient norm and the consequences, and vice versa, cases in which they show a general preference for action regardless of consequences and norms. So, so these ideas basically have led us to develop a computational model that we call the Cni model, that basically identifies in participants' responses to a larger set of model dilemmas, the extent to which they show a response pattern like the one here in the first row. It's like showing action whenever there's a benefits of action are greater than the cost, but a preference for inaction whenever the benefits are smaller than the cost. The extent to which they show a response pattern like this, like when preference for inaction whenever there's a proscriptive norm, but preference for action whenever there's a prescriptive norm, and also quantify general action tendencies. To which extent do they show a general preference for inaction versus action regardless of consequences and norms? So the way we do this, I just want to give you a little bit of an illustration of what kind of dilemmas we are using for that. So this is one example. So here on the left side, you see a scenario where the benefits of action are greater than the costs, and a proscriptive norm prohibits action. So the scenario goes like this. You are the director of a hospital in a developing country. A foreign student who was volunteering in the country got infected with a rare virus. The virus is highly contagious and deadly to seniors and children. The only medication that can effectively stop the virus from spreading has severe side effect. Although the virus will not kill her, the student suffers from chronic immune deficiency that will make her die from these side effects. The question is it acceptable in this case to give the student the medication? So it's a proscriptive dilemma, because actively killing someone, that would be kind of like a violation of the deontological norm that should not kill other people. But in this case, the benefits of action would be greater than the cost. So that's like structurally similar to the trolley problem. But then we also have a variant where everything is the same, except that the benefits of action are now smaller than the costs. And so here, instead of being deadly to seniors and children, the virus just causes severe stomach cramps, which is not great, but it's not killing anyone. So these are the two variants of the prescriptive dilemma, but then we also have like two variants of basic scenarios that are similar, but involve a prescriptive norm. So here, if you look here on the left side, that's the prescriptive dilemma where the benefits of action are smaller than the costs. The dilemma goes like this: you're the director of a hospital in a developing country. A foreign student who's volunteering in the country got infected with a rare virus. The virus is highly contagious and deadly to seniors and children. It's now the part that is now different is the student suffers from a chronic immune deficiency that will make her die from the virus if she's not returned to her home country for special treatment. However, taking her out of quarantine involves a considerable risk that the virus will spread. And the question here is now, is it acceptable in this case to take the student out of quarantine to return her to her home country? So that's basically kind of like the Ebola dilemma that I pointed out at the beginning. So now here we have a prescriptive norm, like to save the student, but doing so may actually may cause much greater damage in a utilitarian sense. And then this case is again contrasted with the case where the benefits of action are greater than the costs. So in this case, we basically have that's the same scenario, but it's just that the virus just causes severe stomach cramps. Okay, and so what we're doing in our research is, so we have a larger set of moral dilemmas or basic dilemmas. Like there's one core dilemma that each of which is presented in 4 different variants, like the variants that I showed you. We started out with a battery of 6 basic dilemmas and 4 variants, so like 24 dilemmas. In our more recent research, we are using a battery of 12 basic dilemmas in 4 variants. It's like 48 dilemmas. And so all of our participants complete all of these dilemmas, and then we use a computational modeling approach called multinomial modeling to identify or quantify the strength of different response tendencies. And so this is like a schematic depiction of our CNI model. So so this table here on the left side, that should be familiar. That's I had that on an earlier slide. So that basically just specifies the different response patterns that we link to sensitivity to consequences, like action whenever the benefits of action are greater than the costs, and inaction whenever the benefits of action are smaller than the costs. Then another response pattern that we link to sensitivity to moral norms. So here that's inaction whenever there's a proscriptive norm, but action whenever there's a prescriptive norm, but then also general preference for inaction versus action, where basically participants show a pattern of general inaction versus general action across all of these 4 kinds of dilemmas. And so in this multinomial processing tree, we have like a parameter that's called C, that stands for sensitivity to consequences, a parameter called N, that's called refers to sensitivity to norms, and a parameter called I, where higher scores mean general preference for inaction, and lower scores mean general preference for action. So it seems like that there's one question.
About it, you can read it, I hope, with the chat, right?
Okay, so the question is, did I understand correctly the general preference for inaction over action was mistakenly identified with a deontological inclination, while it was an example of omission bias? Yes, so I would consider general preference for inaction as kind of like an instance of the omission bias, rather than a deontological inclination, where the deontological inclination is basically inaction whenever there's a proscriptive norm, or action whenever there's a prescriptive norm. I will come back to your question, because one thing that I should say as a caveat, there is actually a deontological interpretation of general inaction as well. So I'm going to come back to that at the end, but that doesn't. That's I would consider as kind of like a terminological issue, but it's like I would still argue the general preference for inaction, even if it's considered an instance of deontological responding, is fundamentally different than sensitivity to norms in the sense of like responding with inaction when there's a proscriptive norm and responding with action when there's a prescriptive norm. And that can be seen here. It's like whenever there's a proscriptive norm, they lead to the same outcome, but whenever there's a prescriptive norm, they actually would lead to different outcomes. And that's why they're like functionally different at the behavioral level, and they also have different antecedents and consequences. Okay, so so what we're doing, we're doing this in the CNI model using a multinomial modeling approach. So the way this works is using this multinomial processing tree, we can actually derive equations that include the parameters C, N, and I as unknowns, and participants observed responses with the probability of showing either an action versus an inaction response on those 4 kinds of dilemmas as known values. So that's what we basically have in the data set. And we can generate these equations and then solve these equations for C, N, and I to get basically numerical estimates for that. So that we can analyze those and see if, like, I don't know, is an experimental manipulation of a factor X, does it influence sensitivity to consequences or sensitivity to norms? And so I just want to like briefly walk you through like how this works. So for example, here is the equation that is implied for the probability of showing an action response whenever there's a proscriptive norm and the benefits of costs, the benefits of action are greater than the costs. So basically this is referring to this column here. And so given that the focus is on action, we would basically have to identify all cases here in which that can produce an action response. So the first case here is this one here, which in the processing path is linked to C. So it starts with C down here. But then there's also another path that can lead to an action response. This is this path here, and that is 1 minus C times 1 minus N times 1 minus I. And that's the second part here. So with that processing tree, we can basically generate 4 equations with 3 unknowns. If we had like the same number of equations and unknowns, we could just use linear algebra to solve these equations for the unknowns, but we have more equations than unknowns. For that reason, we're using maximum likelihood statistics to identify numerical values for C, N, and I that get so that the predicted probabilities of action responses on the 4 kinds of dilemmas get as close as possible to the observed values in the data set. And then we can calculate fit statistics based on the discrepancy of the predicted values and the observed values. And to the extent that the discrepancy is relatively small, we can say that the model fits the data. Then we would like not get a significant deviation between observed and predicted response probabilities. But to the extent that there's a large discrepancy, which we do not want, we would actually get a significant difference between predicted and observed scores, which in this case is like, yeah, with fit statistics, we do not want to get a significant discrepancy. So let me just tell you a little bit about like how does it work with the model fit. So these are just data from our very first paper on the CNI model. So we had a total of 10 studies. There's 8 in the main manuscript and 2 studies that are reported in a supplement. So a total of 10 studies. And what you can see here is there's like one case, study 3A, where we get a significant discrepancy between observed and predicted probabilities, but overall the model fits pretty well. So like 1 out of 10, that's a probability of 10%. We recently did analysis of kind of all of the studies that we've basically done with the CNI model, and we basically get like a probability of like 7% that the in the total set that the model does not fit, which is basically kind of like the same as the or very close to the p equals 0.05. So we would consider these within the realm of like false positive. So overall, the model actually fits pretty well. One way to illustrate how these different components or different factors, such as like sensitivity to consequences captured by C, sensitivity to norms captured by N, and general preference for inaction versus action captured by I, how they can help understand responses to so-called traditional dilemmas. One thing that we've done is we created what could be described as traditional dilemma scores. So traditional dilemma scores we interpret as the preference for action versus inaction on dilemmas where there's a prescriptive norm and the benefits of action outweigh the cost. So that's kind of structurally similar to the trolley problem. And so this is kind of like one of the 4 kinds of dilemmas that we have in our data set. And so what we're doing in our data sets is we calculate C, N, and I, and then predict how participants respond on these like traditional dilemmas. There is a bit of a problem here in the sense that obviously responses on those traditional dilemmas go into the calculation of the CNI parameter scores. And so to avoid statistical dependence in this case, what we've done is we did an odd-even split. So in one case, we calculated the CNI parameters based on all of the dilemmas that had an odd number in our battery, and predicted traditional scores calculated based on dilemmas with even odd numbers and vice versa. So that resolves the statistical dependence issue. And what you can see here is in this multiple regression that all 3 factors, sensitivity to consequences, sensitivity to norms, and general preference for inaction, significantly predict how participants respond on traditional dilemmas. And this is the case where we get like the odd parameter estimate or parameter estimates based on odd numbered dilemmas, predicting traditional scores with even, and you basically can see the opposite part. So all of the 3 components help us understand in the traditional responses to traditional dilemmas, such as that are structurally similar to the trolley problem. So that's kind of like proof of concept. Yeah.
We have one question. I think you can answer now. How you can count the points in which statistical program?
For the traditional scores, or for?
I think the model. For the CNI model.
Sorry,
program, yeah. What statistical program do you recommend to count the?
Okay, so
we model. It's the same, right? If you count the traditional or the
yeah. So we like the CNI model analyses. You need. Well, actually, it's not you need. Like SPSS, unfortunately, doesn't allow you to do that. So we're using a software called Multitree. That's a software that's specifically like designed for multinomial processing analyses. I'm actually going to briefly mention something at the end, like mentioning the workshop that you organized, Mariola, and that will actually include an introduction to Multitree, so like how to do that. To do these calculations within Multitree. And so so that's a special software package, and that's freely available on the internet. It's freeware. It can be downloaded from website of the University of Mannheim in Germany. So that's where the person who developed that software, where he is. But it can also be done within R. So that being said, I have to admit, like, although like several times I thought it's like, okay, I need to sit down and learn R. So, like every time I did it, after 30 minutes, like, I'm sorry, I don't have the time to do that. But for those of you guys who are familiar with R, you can do the multinomial modeling analysis to calculate the CNI parameters within R as well. And for those of you who are interested in using multi-tree, we actually prepared some template files that should make it easier. I will mention that again at the end of the talk. Okay, sorry, I initially didn't understand where we're going with that question. Yeah. Okay, so that's a little bit proof of concept. Like when we look at traditional dilemma responses, such as to responses to dilemmas that are structurally similar to the trolley problem, all of the three factors that we identify in the CNI model are relevant to understand variance on those scores. So now what I'm going to do in the remainder of my talk, I just present two exemplary findings on key variables in the morality literature that just showcase a little bit how the CNI model helps us to get a deeper understanding of the processes underlying moral dilemma judgments. And these studies involve the effects of cognitive load, effects of personal involvement, and individual differences in psychopathy. Let me start with cognitive load. So at the beginning of my talk, I presented Josh Green's dual process theory of moral dilemma judgments. And so the dual process theory argues that utilitarian judgments are the product of controlled cognitive analyses, whereas deontological judgments are the product of automatic effective responses to the idea of causing harm. And so there are a few studies out there that have tested this, or a prediction implied by this assumption, by imposing cognitive load when participants were asked to make a judgment in the trolley dilemma. And so the typical finding is that participants become less so-called utilitarian under cognitive load. So they're more inclined to say, no, it's wrong to redirect the trolley when they're in the cognitive load. And that has been interpreted as evidence for the dual process theory. So in our study, we did something similar. So we had, this was a study conducted on MTurk. So we recruited a total of 200 participants. 6 participants failed an attention check, so that's why the total N here is 194. These participants just completed our battery of CNI model dilemmas, and half of the participants were asked or like all of the participants were like before each dilemma were asked to memorize a digit string of like letters, numbers, and symbols. Keep it in mind while they're working on the dilemma, and then like provide the dilemma response, type in the digit code that they were supposed to memorize, and then move on, like get the new digit code, move on to the next dilemma, and so on. So they had like a total of 24 dilemmas, and for each dilemma there was like a unique digit code, and we had 2 conditions, one condition that we called high load and the other condition that we called low load. The high load condition, the digit strings had always had 8 digits, and there were something like lowercase f for dollar percentage, uppercase T, etc. So it's kind of like a password style. But in the low load condition, the digit strings only had 2 digits, and then we're like maybe something like lowercase h7 or so. So that's that was basically to manipulate the amount of mental or working memory load. So something that you might know is like often these load manipulations involve like a cognitive load, like in our high load condition to no load, but that's a bit of a problem because it confounds the over total amount of mental load with processing goals, that participants not only have higher load, but also have like a processing goal of keeping something else in mind. And so by manipulating high load versus low load, we control for that. And basically get pure effects of cognitive load. So anyways, what did we find in our study? So we basically replicated what everyone else has found in the traditional score. So when we basically just look at the number of action choices in traditional dilemmas, the high load and low load condition, and we score that, like basically higher scores here would mean a greater tendency for the so-called utilitarian response. We do find that participants in the high load condition become, as you might want to say, significantly less utilitarian, in the sense that they're more likely to say, no, this is unacceptable to do this. So that's kind of like replicating earlier findings using the trolley problem. But when we analyze the data with the Cni model, we actually get a little bit of a more nuanced picture. So there's basically only one significant effect here, and that's on the I parameter. So what we find is that under high cognitive load, participants become significantly more action averse, but there's no significant effect on the C parameter and the N parameter. And one thing that I should say, we basically replicated exactly the same effect in a second study using exactly the same materials. So that's kind of like a reliable significant effect, but also reliable null effects. So this suggests that the reason why people become like, I don't know, as you might want to say, like so-called like more utilitarian or less utilitarian under cognitive load is not because they become less sensitive to consequences, it's because they become more action averse. And so this, in my view, has nothing to do with like something like a cognitively effortful cost benefit analysis. Instead, in my view, it's more likely that like participants engage in these like metacognitive reflections, thinking like, okay, if I don't, I feel like I don't have the mental resources to make a well-informed decision. So therefore, maybe let's stay out of the situation, not do anything, because harm caused via inaction doesn't feel as bad as potential harm caused via action. And so it's almost like a kind of like a strategic adjustment of the judgment based on metacognitive inferences about like their ability to reach a well-informed judgment. But that's, again, very different from the idea that consequent or like sensitivity to consequences or utilitarian judgments are cognitively effortful or involve a cognitively effortful cost-benefit analysis. So one thing that I actually just realized I should mention, so all of the parameters can vary between 0 and 1. For the C and the N parameter, the neutral baseline is 0. So that would suggest that like if a score of 0 would suggest that they're just not sensitive to consequences at all. We're not sensitive to norms at all. And so the C parameter is like significantly different from 0, as well as the N parameter, suggesting that although there's like a slight tendency here for high low, that was not significantly different, but they are actually still sensitive to the consequences in the high load condition. That's important. For the I parameter, on the other hand, the neutral baseline is 0.5. So all scores higher than 0.5 would suggest a general preference for inaction, and scores lower than 0.5 would suggest a general preference for action. So that's why the bars are typically like a little bit higher here on the I for the I parameter. And so here what this suggests is that participants in the high load just become significantly more action averse. Okay, so let me move on to the next study that was on personal involvement, and that was inspired by the idea that greater personal involvement enhances the automatic emotional response to the idea of causing harm, which should make people more deontological, according to the dual process theory. So the way this is typically been done in traditional trolley problem research is via the two different variants that are called the switch dilemma and the Footbridge dilemma. So in the switch dilemma, the question is it acceptable to redirect a trolley to a different track where it would kill only one person instead of 5? In the Footbridge dilemma, the question is it acceptable to push an overweight man from a bridge to stop the trolley? And so the argument here is that in the Footbridge dilemma, that involves like direct physical contact. So the personal involvement, there's like personal force involved that it leads to a greater automatic emotional response, which then makes people more deontological. And then that's reflected in the fact that people are more likely to say it's unacceptable to push the man from the bridge compared to the judgment in the switch dilemma. That they're more likely to say it's wrong to push the man of the bridge than to say it's wrong to redirect the trolley. Okay, so these kind of manipulations are a little tricky in our like standardized CNI model battery. So we had to find a different way of manipulating personal involvement. And so the way we've done it in our studies is by actually changing the question framing. So in one condition, we are giving the relatively abstract question that's pretty common in the literature, kind of like, is this like acceptable to do that? But in the other condition, we asked them, would you do this? And so basically kind of like getting participants personally involved instead of just like making an abstract judgment about the acceptability. Is like, if you were in the situation, would you do this? And so the idea is that personal involvement is greater when we give them the action framing than when we give them the acceptability framing. So in this case, we had, again, 200 participants on Amazon's MTurk, 11 failed an attention check. And so with this manipulation, so we did find a mean level difference that was consistent with prior research, but not statistically significant, in the sense that when participants asked to if they would do it, that they're more likely to say no, they wouldn't do it, as compared to when we just asked them, is it acceptable to do it? So yeah, so the mean level difference is consistent with this idea that personal involvement would make people more deontological in dual process terms. But as I said, the difference here was not significant. But that doesn't mean that there was no like more nuanced difference between the two conditions, and that you can actually see in the CNI model analyses. So here we find a pretty massive effect that participants are just way more action averse when we ask them, would you do this? Than when we ask them, is it acceptable? So they would say, it's like, yes, it's acceptable, but I wouldn't do this. So that increased action aversion can lead to greater, like so-called deontological responding in traditional dilemmas, such as a trolley problem. But interestingly, there's also another significant effect that was basically going in the opposite direction, in the sense that participants actually became much less sensitive to norms in the moral action condition. So that's actually going directly against the idea that participants become more deontological under personal involvement. So assuming that like sensitivity to norms is inherently linked to, or like can be interpreted as a pattern of deontological responding, here one would conclude that they actually become less deontological. So again, like the pattern seems to be driven by action aversion, not by deontological responding in the sense of sensitivity to moral norms. Okay, so the final set of studies that I want to present is on psychopathy. So as I pointed out earlier in my talk, there is actually a considerable body of research showing that participants high in psychopathy tend to be more likely to show the like a so-called utilitarian response in the traditional trolley dilemma. And as I said, it seems a little bit paradox to conclude from that finding that people high in psychopathy would show greater concern for maximizing the well-being of a large number of people. It seems more likely that psychopaths just like don't care about causing harm, but you would not be able to tell that from their responses in the trolley problem. Okay, so to get like a more nuanced understanding of how psychopathy may be related to differences in moral dilemma judgments, so we are in a study where we initially recruited a sample of 500 men of MTurk, on Amazon's MTurk. So these participants completed just like a standard psychopathy scale. So in this study, it was the Levinson psychopathy scale, self-report psychopathy measure. And then based on the scores on the psychopathy measure, we identified the participants with scores in the highest quartile and the lowest quartile of the sample. And we invited them back a week later to complete our Cni model, dilemma battery, and then we analyzed the responses. And in this study, we exclusively focused on men because there are differences in moral dilemma judgments, as well as differences in psychopathy between men and women. And so we didn't want to confound differences in psychopathy with gender differences, and so for that reason, in these like initial studies, we exclusively focused on men. And so with that, we actually got 198 men who returned to complete our Cni model battery, and these are the results. And as I said, like about half of them were like high in psychopathy, and about half of them were low in psychopathy. And so again, if we use like the traditional approach to analyzing the data, focusing only on so-called traditional dilemmas that are structurally similar to the trolley problem, we basically replicate what other people have found numerous times before us, that people high in psychopathy seem more utilitarian on these traditional dilemmas as participants low in psychopathy. But again, does this mean that people high in psychopathy care more about maximizing well-being? No, if anything, it's the opposite the case. So we actually find massive differences in all of the three parameters. So the largest difference, this is like the largest difference that we ever got in all of our Cni model work, is on the N parameter. So participants high in psychopathy, that's actually the only time that we found a score that is not significantly different from zero. They just show basically zero sensitivity to norms. And that's significantly different to participants low in psychopathy. But they also differ in their action tendencies. So participants low in psychopathy, they just are much more action averse than participants high in psychopathy. So you could say like participants high in psychopathy, they're just like willing to act regardless of consequences and norms. They just don't care. But interestingly, on the C parameter, we find that participants high in psychopathy actually show a lower sensitivity to consequences than participants low in psychopathy. So that's exactly opposite to what would be suggested by the responses on the trolley problem. So we would say psychopaths are more utilitarian. It's like, this suggests exactly the opposite. No, psychopaths are actually less utilitarian if utilitarianism is interpreted as in terms of sensitivity to consequences. But you would not be able to detect that because all of these influences are confounded in the traditional dilemma approach, such as the trolley problem, and they kind of like mash each other and lead to a mash. And then the reason why we find these differences is because we just have this ginormous difference on the N parameter that basically overrides everything else. Okay, and then so we also have run a few follow-up studies recently with a larger set of moral dilemmas where we used an individual difference approach instead of an extreme groups approach. And this actually now includes both men and women. So what you can see here, like if I direct your attention to the bottom. So this is again the traditional dilemma score. And so basically like a positive correlation suggests that like people high in psychopathy would be like more utilitarian in the traditional sense. And again, so these are the correlations. They're like significant across all of these 4 studies. But again, what this what's behind this pattern is kind of like a pretty massive negative correlation between psychopathy and sensitivity to moral norms. Which I mean, these correlations I find pretty fascinating because sometimes you can have measures of the same construct, like 2 psychopathy measures that show correlations that may sometimes don't get to that level, that are more like in the range of like 0.40, 0.50. Whereas here, that's like something fundamentally different. It's basically kind of like, it basically the sensitivity to an experimental manipulation that correlates at that level with measures, standard measures of psychopathy. Again, also we find these like the tendency that people high in psychopathy just much less action averse. And again, also across all of these 4 studies, we find that people high in psychopathy are actually less sensitive to consequences, suggesting that they care less about maximizing the greater good, which we would not be able to tell from the traditional analyses. Okay, so let me wrap up and draw some conclusions and tell you a little bit about some other work that we've done. First and foremost, I would say that the Cni model provides much more nuanced insights into the determinants of moral dilemma judgments, and I hope that this excerpt of findings that I showed you today helped me to convince you that that is the case. And I would also argue that the empirical findings obtained with the Cni model pose a pretty substantial challenge to the dual process model of moral judgment. One thing that I should say is that we've been a little bit in kind of like a debate with Josh Green about like how to explain certain kind of findings. One thing that I should acknowledge, it is possible to basically construct a post hoc explanation for each individual finding with the Cni model that is consistent with the dual process model. So like, I don't know, with the cognitive load, it is possible to construct a post hoc explanation. For the personal involvement, it is possible to construct a post hoc explanation. We have some other findings on like incidental happiness. It's possible to construct a post hoc explanation. The problem is that for each individual post hoc explanation, you need to make assumptions, and these assumptions are sometimes inconsistent with each other. So in some sense, you cannot claim X to explain one finding, but then basically claim the opposite of X to explain a different finding. And that's, I think, where we get into problems. I think there's no a priori conflict between the Cni model and the dual process model, because the Cni model is basically just like a descriptive theory of response patterns, whereas the dual process model aims to identify the mental processes underlying responses. But once you look at these effects that we get with the Cni model, they're kind of like difficult to reconcile with the dual process model for exactly that reason. I mean, like if you basically, the only way to save a mental process theory is by basically contradicting yourself, then I think is a problem with the theory. Something that people might point out, and that's sometimes coming from Josh Green's camp or the dual process camp, is oh, but there's all this neuroscientific evidence in Josh Green's earlier studies showing that like deontological judgments are linked with like more emotional areas in the brain, and utilitarian judgments are linked with more cognitive reasoning areas of the brain. I mean, there's actually a number of problems with that argument, and the evidence is actually not as clear cut. If you actually go back to the original papers, that there's like the so-called deontological judgments is also associated with like so-called cognitive areas and etc. But if we ignore that for now, one thing that I would actually say is that there's a more fundamental issue in the sense that all of the neuroscientific evidence is actually based on the trolley problem, and the trolley problem is inherently flawed. So if you basically use a flawed behavioral paradigm, the neuroscientific evidence actually doesn't tell you much. And so in that sense, I think we basically would have to start from scratch and figuring out what these like neural markers are actually related to. And then finally, I would also like to point out one major advantage, and that's that the Cni model resolves a paradoxical finding obtained with the traditional paradigm. Like with the traditional paradigm, it seems almost absurd to conclude that people high in psychopathy would care more about maximizing well-being for the greater good, whereas in the Cni model, it's clear where this is coming from. It's not that participants high in psychopathy care about maximizing the greater good. They just like are not sensitive to norms. They're just like much less action averse, and those two actually conceal they're actually a weaker sensitivity to consequences among people high in psychopathy. So if anything, they're actually less utilitarian rather than more utilitarian. That being said, one thing that I should say that I briefly alluded to in the discussion of the dual process model, the Cni model is just a descriptive model that describes response patterns. It does not describe the mental processes underlying moral judgments. Like, is it driven by cognitive reasoning, or is it driven by emotional responses? So these processes are still unclear. What we do know, I would say, is that the dual process model is wrong, but at this point, we don't really have an alternative yet. That's something that we were working toward, like basically kind of like taking the aggregate of all of our empirical findings, like what what mental process theory would makes the most sense based on the data that we get with the Cni model, but that's still in the development. Okay, and then I'm going to briefly mention a few other findings that we have with the Cni model. So we worked a little bit on incidental emotions. So what does incidental happiness, incidental sadness, or incidental anger do to moral judgment? So we don't find any effects for sadness and anger, but we do replicate earlier findings in happiness, makes people like so-called more utilitarian in the traditional paradigm, but that's driven by a reduced sensitivity to norms and happiness. We have done work on social power. How do people in high versus low power roles and or feelings of high versus low power respond to moral dilemmas, and why do they show the differences that they have? It's actually a very interesting area because there's different theories of social power out there that would suggest different things about like people in high power being more sensitive to consequences, or following, or less sensitive to norms, or just like less action averse. And so we've done some work on that. Similarly, we've done some work on testosterone. Specifically looking at exogenous testosterone manipulations with Mariola and Michael Bielek. We've done some work on foreign language use. How does that influence moral dilemma judgments, and how does that pan out in terms of the Cni model? Then more recently, we have moved a little bit into kind of like trying to understand individual differences beyond psychopathy. Where we looked at personality traits such as the Big Five, and we also looked at the temporal stability of the three components. And one thing that we find there is that sensitivity to consequences and sensitivity to moral norms is actually relatively, or individual differences in those two are actually relatively stable over time. But we find much less or much lower temporal stability for general action tendencies on the I parameter. So that seems to be kind of like more fluctuating over time. We've done some work on political ideology. So there's some work suggesting that conservatives are like more deontological in the traditional trolley problem, and that has sometimes been interpreted as that conservatives care more about norms. Our findings do not support that idea. Our findings suggest that they're just less sensitive to consequences. But like in terms of the overall norm sensitivity, liberals and conservatives are actually pretty much the same. Some recent work with my new grad student, Nick Snick. We've looked at uncertainty. So like one thing that's a bit of a problem in moral dilemma research is that usually there's like some sort of a determinism kind of like implied in the description of the dilemmas, but so that the outcomes are pretty clear. But that's pretty much never the case in real world scenarios. Like we don't know what is the likelihood. Like sometimes we may know the likelihood of something, but it's like there's much greater uncertainty when we have to make moral decisions in real world scenarios. And what she has found in a series of 3 studies so far is that greater uncertainty about outcomes actually makes people less sensitive to consequences, but it does not affect their sensitivity to norms or their general action tendencies. And again, there's alternative views out there that would suggest something different, that people under uncertainty would just like fall back onto moral norms to make their decisions, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And then finally, one set of studies that we have planned is that we haven't done yet, but we have like a manuscript for a registered report under review right now, where we want to use the Cni model parameters to predict other kinds of moral behavior, such as like cheating and helping behavior, pro-social and anti-social behavior. Okay, so I'm gonna finish here. So for those of you who may be interested in kind of using our Cni model in their own work and like playing a little bit with that. So up here, this is the reference to the first article that we published on the Cni model that basically explains all the basics. The link down here is you can basically download a zip file that includes not only all our materials, the moral dilemmas that we've been using, but it also includes multi-tree template files for that software that we've been using that I mentioned earlier, to make it as easy as possible to analyze the data. Down here, this is a reference. So one disadvantage of like the initial dilemma battery is was that it was just like too small for reliable individual difference estimates. The way this typically works is that the estimates basically aggregate across participants in different groups. So this like it's easy to do for like extreme group approaches or experimental comparisons. But for individual difference analysis, you would have to basically fit the data of each individual participant. And for that, with our initial dilemma battery, the number of observations was just too small to get reliable estimates in the individual level. And so this paper down here presents a larger dilemma battery that makes the Cni model suitable or amenable for individual difference analyses. And down here, the link is gets you to materials that are specifically for doing individual difference analyses with the Cni model, also including multi-tree template files. And for those of you who are really interested in learning more about this, so Mariola has organized a workshop that will take place on July 13th. I don't know if it's already been announced, but where I will give an introduction into multinomial modeling of moral judgments. That will be a little more general, that kind of like how multinomial works, specifically in the context of the Cni model, but also broader other kinds of moral judgments of how multinomial modeling can be used to gain more insights. And that workshop will include some hands-on exercises so that you can kind of like familiarize yourself with the multi-tree software and how to do this. And if you then still have any questions, feel free to contact me. I'm always happy to help out. Okay, and I'm gonna finish here and thank my collaborators who work with me on these studies, my grad students, research assistants, and the funding agency that helped to fund and pay for this research. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bertram, for a very interesting lecture. I've just sent on the chat the link if someone is interested in the workshops. Of course, the workshops are for free. You don't have to pay for it. You just have to be with optimistic attitude, right? I do not see more questions, but maybe someone would like to ask something. I see something on chat. I will check it.
Hi, I may have a question. Yeah.
Christian.
Yeah, Christian. Hi.
Hi.
I'm Krystian Barzykowski from Jagiellonian University Institute of Psychology Applied Memory Research Laboratory. Thank you for your talk. It's extremely interesting, and I'm fascinated by the topic for quite a long time, and I am a memory researcher, which brings me to the question, do you have any idea how to combine, for example, your model with memory studies? So what I have in mind is, would you be eager to propose some expectations relating to how people, maybe different types of people, would remember their own behaviors, actions, or about morally related behaviors or decisions or whatever. So how do we remember behaving in a situation that are not morally neutral? I think it would be extremely interesting. So do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I actually think that this question even goes far beyond the CNI model. It's like you can, and I think there's like a couple of interesting things here. Like one is basically kind of like from a purely cognitive point of view, that you get kind of like selective memory distortions based on purely cognitive processes. But I know this, I can't remember the name of the authors. I'm using one of their articles in my social cognition class on kind of like motivated distortions of memory to basically see yourself in kind of like a morally good way. And so, and I think that's a fascinating topic, because that's like, I personally find this extremely fascinating when kind of like motivational and cognitive processes kind of like interact with each other, and you basically get kind of like motivational influences on some very basic processes, including things like memory. And so yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. I mean, in terms of like applying it to moral dilemma judgments and the CNI model work, there is some work by Jim Everett suggesting that in the traditional dilemma, people think that those who make deontological judgments are just more trustworthy, more likable, more moral, etc. And so there's some nuances to that. What we find in the CNI model, we're using a slightly different approach to get at that, but we find that it's specifically sensitivity to norms that is related to perceptions of morality. So sensitivity to consequences, greater or lower sensitivity to consequences, doesn't really make any difference for people's perception of morality. It's specifically sensitivity to norms. It's also not like general action tendencies. And so linking that to the ideas that you suggested, I can actually imagine that it's like people may also want to see themselves as like more sensitive to norms. That's kind of like, but it does not necessarily mean that they are more sensitive to norms. And so we do have some preliminary findings, not for like self-perception, but like group perception. So when we ask liberals and conservatives to think about how, like we give them the dilemmas and we tell them, how do you think a typical liberal would respond in this dilemmas, and how do you think a typical conservative would respond in these dilemmas? No difference in sensitivity to consequences, no difference in general action tendencies, but we find this massive in-group bias that each group sees their own group as more sensitive to norms than the other group. I mean, we don't directly ask them, like, oh, is your group sensitive to norms? It's just like, what would a person of this group do? Obviously, that has nothing to do with memory yet, but it suggests that there's like something here that's where there could be inherently like motivational influences that then could be interesting to link to memory, especially for like self-related memory, autobiographical memory, where we could get like interesting memory distortions as a function of like motivated self-perception.
Okay, thank you. And I also have one idea that maybe there may be also interesting effect when we look at action and inaction. We have already some studies showing that we regret from distant past something we did not do, while we regret from recent past something that we actually did. So maybe when we ask people about some situation when they behave in a non-moral way, maybe there would be interesting interaction between distant and remote past, for example.
Yeah.
So
That's fascinating. Like I do remember my former grad student Paul Conway, who's been like working with me on some of these projects. They recently had a paper on like different levels of regret. They didn't use the CNI model, but I think they had like affective versus cognitive regret something. But I think it's a fascinating question. Moving this is kind of like what do you regret? Which actions or inactions do you regret? Under which conditions? Is it like distant path versus close path? Is it like yeah, I absolutely agree. There's like some interesting directions in that regard. I mean, unfortunately, the CNI model imposes also, although it's kind of like more nuanced, but it imposes a little bit of kind of constraints of what you can do and cannot do, and some things may actually work with the trolley dilemma, where it's relatively easy to do certain things. But yeah, these are all fascinating questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Christian. I also like your ideas. I am now creating with my colleagues a regret scale, so maybe we can do something like that. But it's a live regret. And I confirm, because I read, I think, almost everything about regrets in psychology in the last year. And most people regret the things that they did not do in life. They do not regret people they tried to do and, failed. And regret, it's kind of, I think, a new direction in psychology. I'm definitely trying also to do some studies there, because it's extremely interesting, and almost no one does it in the world. There are also no like a good regret scale, like in English. We have one more question on the chat, Bertram, or even two more.
So the question is, would it be possible to adapt the measure to study attitudes towards specific problems? And the person who's asking questions about investigating attitudes toward new technologies, and is it like explain technology aversion in CNI framework? Or has someone already done that? So to answer the last question, I don't know if anyone has ever done that. I don't think so. I don't think that the CNI model specifically can be moved into that, but multinomial modeling, depending on kind of like what the relevant variables are, I think could be used to actually extract different components in technology aversion. That's like different. I mean, in some sense, different reasons why people may be reluctant to adopt technology. Generalized aversion may be one of them, but there may be others. I'm not too familiar with that. And by systematically creating different scenarios where you manipulate these different factors, and then developing a multinomial model for that, I think it may be possible. But it's like, I would have to know a little bit more about like what are the relevant factors in research on the adoption of technology. And I think that the most difficult part that I would see is basically based on the identification of the relevant factors, is basically creating these scenarios. That has also been the most challenging task for us, like creating these scenarios for the CNI model. The CNI model in of itself, that was relatively easy, but it's kind of like that's the validation process, and it took us actually several years to come up with this extended battery for individual difference research. And like in the early stages, we utterly failed because we couldn't get like the dilemmas to work. But now we have it, but that depends a little bit on kind of like what the relevant factors are. It may actually be the case that in technology adoption, maybe it's easier to manipulate the relevant features.
One more question on the chat. It was before that one. Which directions should research on CNI go? What would you be interested in as a researcher concerning this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it partly depends on like also personal interest. So we're removing this work in our own lab now, and kind of like using it to predict moral behavior. That's like one line of research. Another line of research is kind of moving it more into kind of like moral perception. That's like related to these in-group biases. So there's like moral superiority effect that each political group perceives their own in-group as kind of like morally superior than the political out-group. But that's just like something that we're currently working on. And there may be other people out there who think like, oh, it would be interesting to do that. That's things that I haven't even thought about. One other thing for myself, where I have to admit we haven't really made as much progress on as I would hope, is basically understanding the underlying mental mechanisms. Because as I said in my conclusion, one thing that I like concluded for myself, and that I don't know, maybe I can be as bold as kind of like, one thing that we know for sure now is that the Green's dual process model is wrong. I mean, I know it's a bold claim, but that's what I would conclude. But as I said, we don't really have an alternative. We don't know like what exactly is like the mental process underlying sensitivity to consequence. What is the mental process underlying sensitivity to norms? And what is the mental process underlying general action tendencies? And it may even be possible that it's actually for each of the three, that it's not just one, but there's actually like multiple processes. Like it for example, entirely possible. I think it's like difficult to reconcile, but like hypothetically, it would be possible that there is an like automatic effective response or an emotional process that contributes to one, like maybe to general action aversion, or like, let's say hypothetically to sensitivity to norms, in the sense that it's like, it's the automatic emotional response to the idea of violating a moral norm. That's actually much more consistent with our findings. But at the same time, it may also be people's more cognitive analyses of moral norms, and that both independently contribute to greater sensitivity to moral norms. And so so it doesn't have to be kind of like, oh, it's only one or the other, but it's like the three parameters of the Cni model basically just classify response patterns, and that each response pattern may actually be driven by different mental processes that can lead to the same outcome. And that's, I think, where we still don't know that much.
I would like to ask one more question, Bertram. Hi, by the way. How would we need to do the research on those processes to discover them? Do you think about neuroimaging or something else?
I don't think we need neuroimaging for that. And I don't know, I have to admit, like, I've become much more of a skeptic of social neuroscience. I think many social neuroscience studies tell us more about the brain rather than, or how the brain works, rather than about mechanisms and human behavior. So it's like, it's often framed in as like, oh, we look at the brain and then we really understand what's going on. But I think it's like having a good understanding of people's behavior and then imaging that, like, tells us something about the brain. That we, that's how I think it's hard not having anything. It's like, because it doesn't, it's like, it's hard. Where do you start? I think, and that's basically where we are right now. We basically have to work in a bottom up kind of way. It's like, okay, so this is the findings that we have. What makes the most sense based on these empirical findings of what happens at the mental level? And then generate a theory, and then ideally that theory would give us novel predictions that we could test. And then I think in some sense, if the theory is good in the sense that it's not just like, I don't know, explains everything but doesn't predict anything, these kind of theories, then we would actually have like a starting point on how to move forward. But we're not there yet. I think the work that would need to be done at this point is that bottom up work. It's kind of like, okay, like, here's the full set of findings, and engage in some creative theorizing about kind of like, okay, what could it be? And then create a theory and then use that theory to derive novel predictions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure we have any more time for questions, but I was just curious. We did. Okay, lovely.
Yeah, we do, yeah.
Really, really interesting talk. Thank you. I was wondering, in the study where you looked at psychopathy, you mentioned that in the second one you did collect the sample of both men and women. I'm a clinical psychologist, so from my perspective, I was wondering if you looked at any sex differences in the CNI model between men and women, specifically in psychopathy, but perhaps in general.
Yeah. So with these analyses, when we like lump, like in the psychopathy studies, when we like have men and women, what we typically do is we analyze the data once with the total sample, and then also controlling for gender, just to make sure that we don't like have a confound there. And pretty much in all of these cases, those relations come out both ways. Like even when we do control for gender and when we do not control for gender. We have like a relatively new study with, I mean, if you're clinical psych, you might know Craig Newman from the Hare-Newman scale. So we recently started a collaboration with him on like looking at like different facets. And I think that was the first time that we actually looked a little bit more like nuances, like does the pattern, like if we do like SEM analyses, does the pattern differ for men and women? And so by and large, like it's, we get the same pattern. I think there was like one difference between men and women, I think, for sensitivity to consequences, that like for men, the higher they score on psychopathy, the greater or the less sensitive to consequences they are. Whereas for women, we find like a slight tendency in the opposite direction, but I'm not sure if it was significant. But that's kind of like the first time we found that. So I'm not sure, that might even be a false positive. So, just like in terms of the general question, what we typically find is there's a pretty substantial gender difference on N. Women are more sensitive to norms than men, which I think is like especially important in the context of psychopathy, with like men generally being more likely to like score high in psychopathy than women, and also showing that the same difference on N. But we also find smaller but significant differences on C and I. That no, actually no difference on C, but there's also a difference on I, that women tend to be a little more action averse than men, but they do not differ in sensitivity to consequences.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I do not see more questions on the chat, but maybe someone would like to ask something. I was wondering if, like, we can save and we try to check the CNI model under the influence of alcohol, right? It could be understood like some kind of looking for the mechanism or not. Because people, when they are, you know, intoxicated, theoretically and from past research, they have or they feel more pleasure and positive emotions usually, and also their cognition is lower, right? Their cognitive reflection. This is what we know from the past studies.
Yeah.
Usually done on, you know, small samples and so on. But this is the field.
Yeah, the tricky thing with alcohol is that I think it actually does multiple things, and then again that it's like we may find an effect, which in our case we didn't, but that it makes the manipulation a little bit difficult, because like if you find an effect of alcohol, it could be driven by lack of inhibition. It could be driven by not caring much about norms anymore if you're an influence. It could be driven by reduced executive control. So that's kind of like tricky. It's like all of these things may play a role, but in each case you don't really know what it is. And so in some sense you would have to know like almost kind of like the mechanisms first in order to interpret the alcohol results. And
yeah, I agree. The literature is mixed. I think the good idea would be, to do more controls about emotions, about theological stuff. I know that Dries Boston now does the study, replicating his past finding about, mice. You know what I'm talking about? Psych science paper of Dries Boston, and now he control more things. So I think it could be also interesting to do. I have a last question. Sure. I don't see a question, but I have a hard question. Okay, sorry. I think, from the meta perspective, like why we want to get information if someone is deontological or utilitarian. The one thing or the one point I'm thinking about is that we just want to have a good measure, right? To know if someone is utilitarian or deontologist, because it's crucial for self-perception, right? Because we know that we prefer people who are sensitive to norms. The other thing you just answered for my question during the lecture, because you told me about predicting the behavior, right? Do you see any other, points that would be, crucial for us from some, I'm thinking about some general understanding, right? Like why we want to use that measure, because we want to do self-perception.
I mean, I want to be very careful about that that claim that I'm making. So it's like please take that with a grain of salt. But one thing that I find extremely fascinating is the relation with psychopathy. But it's like in a standard psychopathy measure, like the standard self-reports psychopathy measure. There, like some of these things are pretty obvious what they're trying to get at. It's like, oh, like I enjoy torturing animals, and so there is this debate about like the people high in psychopathy, especially in kind of like the go beyond like the clinical threshold. If they like, do they lack like a basic understanding of like what is morally right or wrong, or is it that they have this understanding but they just don't care? And but assuming that they do have some sort of understanding, it would be relatively easy for someone high in psychopathy to basically check a different response. Let's say if there are in a kind of like a, let's say in a prison context, and it's like, or you could fake psychopathy to basically not go to prison, but then get like the answer, okay, you're not like responsible for your crime because you don't understand right and wrong. And so, but on the other hand, if in a different context, you want to avoid appearing as like a psychopath, you could easily change that, as long as you have like some basic understanding. The thing with the Cni model dilemmas that I think is fascinating, because all of these scenarios are inherently ambiguous. So it's like, what is the right thing to do? Is it going with the consequences? Is it going with the norms? Is it not doing anything? And just like, there's always multiple options that may seem right. And it's basically the overall response pattern that matters. And one thing that we do know is yes, the sensitivity to moral norms, that factor, that in virtually all of our studies is the main driver of things. And I don't know if you remember the multiple regression analyses and also the psychopathy. The N was usually the one that showed the highest correlation with everything. And so one thing that I could imagine, and that's where now we also see some interest from the clinical community and the community in forensics, where we started collaborating with some people, that maybe there is, I mean, it's still a long way to get there, but maybe there is a basis for the Cni model to function as a diagnostic instrument to gauge sensitivity to norms specifically as a risk factor. But I think for that we need like more validation in kind of like with incarcerated prisoners and things like that. That's a kind of like, can this maybe serve as a predictive tool for not well, in the forensic context, it's not relapse. What is the term when they go out of prison, but then like,
they come back to prison, right?
Red, yeah. I'm blanking on the term. Like clinical psychologists call it relapse, but in the forensic, there's a similar term with but I can't remember that term.
Recidivism.
Recidivism, exactly. That was the. And if you can predict recidivism, for example, based on parameter scores on N, and that we are doing a better job with N predicting recidivism as compared to maybe, I don't know, like some other standard instruments. I think that would be kind of like a fascinating applied direction to go to.
So it's about the prevention of violence or just helping in the resocialization.
Yep.
Yeah, the question is about practical therapeutic. It's not it's just about the understanding. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for that, I think there is potential. We have some, I think, like some solid data that suggests that it might be worth trying. But I think there's still a lot of work that would need to be done in order to make sure that we're not prematurely using something as an instrument and then utterly fail down the road, or like misclassify people. And
okay, thank you. I don't see more questions on the chat. Okay, the last chance for a question. Okay, thank you very much, Bertram, again for your interesting talk.
And thanks for organizing this.
And if anyone has questions in English, you can ask Bertram by email. And if you have questions in Polish, I'm very happy also to answer. I translated all the two in Polish, both versions, and I use this model in my research. So I would be happy also to answer on all your concerns in Polish language. And of course, we both invite you to the workshop. You just need to register and that's it. We will send you more information later on email.
Mariola, can I just quickly ask you a question? So participants for the workshop would have to register and you would like know who's coming? Okay, because one thing that we should probably talk about closer to the date, it actually would be helpful if the participants of the workshop would install Multitree on their computers ahead of time, and then we can actually do a little bit of hands-on exercises for that.
Do not worry. Yeah.
Good.
I will make it. We will do it this way, not to waste time.
Okay.
That's fine. Yeah.
Great.
Okay, so thank you again for your lecture. Have a great day, because you're just, starting your day. We just finished our day because Bertram is in Texas. So thank you again, and thank you all of you for participation.
Thank you so much again. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.